More as this story unfolds. Nick, thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, Manafort is facing a raft of charges, including conspiracy against the United States. His trial in the Washington case is scheduled for September, and on the related charges in Virginia, they're set for July the 25th. Why two different trials, and what's the difference?
That's right, yes. Two different trials taking place over the next few months. As you mentioned there, one in July, then one in September. That one in July taking place outside of Washington, D.C., in the neighboring state of Virginia, set to take place in the town of Alexandria, looking at lesser charges in comparison to the one in September. That first one looking at charges including bank fraud, tax evasion, failing to report foreign bank accounts. The bigger trial, really the one of the two that all eyes will be upon, is that one in September, looking at money laundering in the region of $18 million and illegal lobbying. Paul Manafort accused of working with, at the time, the pro-Russian government in Ukraine, trying to build up contacts here in the United States. So two trials to separate those two things. It is the second one which is much bigger, but of course he is the central figure right in the middle of the Robert Mueller investigation. He's the special counsel who's investigating claims of collusion between the Russian government and the Trump team in the run-up to the 2016 election, those accusations of meddling. Paul Manafort very much at the centre of those claims, and those things will unfold in the course of those two trials over the coming months.
Now, Nick, should President Donald Trump be worried by the latest developments? Can he be dragged into this trial?
Well, that is the big worry. The thinking now is that with Paul Manafort spending time in jail ahead of those two trials, there is a possibility that he may want to try and cut a deal with the special investigator Robert Mueller. Now, it's unclear exactly what type of deal he could cut, or indeed what type of information he may have against Donald Trump. But bear in mind that he was the former campaign chairman for President Trump. In theory, he was very close to the president in the run-up to the 2016 election. Donald Trump tells the story slightly differently. He says that Paul Manafort only worked for him 49 days and that they weren't that close. And he says that what has happened is a shame, but he's very much trying to distance himself from his former chairman. There is some concern, though, with all of this swirling around, with Paul Manafort now going to jail rather than being released back on house arrest, on bail, that he may want to try and fast-track proceedings and try and get himself out of what is already, but even more so, a very difficult spot.
Now, Nick, President Trump has gone as far as totally discrediting this investigation into the Russian meddling in the election in 2016. What's your take on this, and what's the reaction from the people in the White House? What are they saying with regards to a president seemingly who's got a lot of affiliates or people who were around him at a point in time, going through all these different stages of having to prove his innocence?
Well, it certainly doesn't look good, as they would say here in the United States. The optics of this don't look good. We have Donald Trump at the centre, and as you say, a whole host of different people around him who have been indicted on criminal charges relating to potential collusion with pro-Russian entities. Now, Donald Trump, remember, throughout has said that there has been no collusion. He's called the investigation by Robert Mueller a witch hunt. Barely a day goes by where he's not tweeting some sort of reaction to that. He very much strongly denies that there was any connections between himself and the Russian government, that the Russians helped to swing the election in his favour nearly 2 years ago. But like you say, it is somewhat difficult for outsiders and particularly Donald Trump critics to look at this objectively and say, if the people around him are being indicted on these type of crimes, is there any possibility that the president himself was connected? There has been no links so far, but of course there have been several people who've been dragged into this investigation and are now facing criminal charges and trials as well.
Now, President Trump claims that a report by a watchdog reporting the documenting failings by the FBI exonerates him from any allegations. Do you think this is realistic? Does this stand? Is the report exonerating him in any way? And if it is exonerating him, why the continued investigations? For instance, as you mentioned earlier, Manafort has been called out to go to jail. More than likely, he is going to cut a deal, as you mentioned. What are the chances that we could see a U.S. sitting president having to face maybe the same thing?
Well, I'll come to that point second, but first, on that internal investigation, it certainly is an interesting way to pass it. The President very much saying that internal review by the Justice Department's Inspector General, looking at the actions of the former FBI Director James Comey in the run-up to the election, where he spoke about Donald Trump's rival in the election, Hillary Clinton, the fact that she'd been using a private email server in her communications, the fact that James Comey gave out all of that information just weeks before the election was something that was being investigated by this internal review. Now, the findings of that essentially said that James Comey was insubordinate, but he was not politically biased. Donald Trump has turned it to say that essentially it exonerates him, and he's saying that it does in fact show that James Comey was himself biased in the way that he did it. In terms of whether or not a sitting president would have to face the type of charges we've seen come up for Paul Manafort, at this stage it doesn't look likely. But of course Robert Mueller is in the midst of this investigation. He has been targeting high-profile figures in Donald Trump's team, people who used to work for the man who is now the president. There is of course the possibility of trying to target the president himself, but so far that connection in terms of the investigation has not definitively been made.
Now let's talk about President Trump's announcement of the 25% tariffs on China's goods. How was it taken in the corridors of power?
Well, it's certainly been met with some consternation from both parties, but also from global stock markets as well. This was something that was expected. We've had the rhetoric, we've had the warnings that Donald Trump was looking to impose this. I think now we've got to the point where the rubber essentially meets the road. He has said that $50 billion worth of Chinese goods will have these 25% tariffs imposed on them. It's being done in two stages. First of all, somewhere in the region of about $34 billion worth of goods, about 800 products, will have those tariffs imposed on the 6th of July. The other $16 billion worth is still being negotiated. There's still a list that the White House is trying to draw up. But we have seen reaction, including from the likes of the IMF director, Christine Lagarde, saying that she has serious reservations about this, thinking it will have a global impact, that there will be losers on both sides. Here in the United States, stock markets have turned red for the day on the point where we had the announcement first thing this morning. The Dow, the S&P, the Nasdaq, those three indexes all turned negative, and they've remained that way throughout the day. And with China promising retaliatory measures, there is real concern that this tit-for-tat trade war that has been kind of rumbling along for a couple of months is now getting to a point where we are seeing escalation. And the Chinese also asking other countries around the world to take similar retaliatory measures against the United States. It certainly has concerned some of the Democrats, but we're also seeing critics and analysts saying that what Donald Trump has done may actually end up hurting the very people that he's been trying to protect, the very people who voted for him, the heartland of America, that rural Midwest. The type of people who work in farming and automotive industries are the people who might get hit hardest by the tariffs. For example, China is proposing similar tariffs on soybeans, something that comes from that Midwest area. So therefore, we may see rising prices for the United States, but also job losses as well. So certainly some consternation that what the president is doing could potentially boomerang back to him and hurt the people that he's very much been championing throughout his presidency.
Nick, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That was our correspondent, Nick Harper, joining us live from New York. Time